The podcast is back, but it's back in a revamped and very different way. So, in this very, very short and sweet update, I just want to catch you up to date, tell you what's been going on behind the scenes, and invite you into this new and up-leveled version of Essence. So, there's a huge pivot that's happened. And in short, I want to say shit has pivoted. Like, we are on a new level and we have shifted gears. And the way that I can best describe this feeling is like we are no longer driving on the country roads. We have shifted up our gears and we are getting on the highway. We have gotten onto the highway and things are really moving forward. So this has shaken up everything that I thought that I knew about where my work was taking me, where the work with clients was going. And it has introduced an entirely new era of the work that we're doing here. And in turn, of course, what I want to be sharing with you here on the Essence podcast. So, you know, the moment when everything just clicks and comes together. Maybe you've experienced this for yourself in your relationships. Maybe it's been at work or in your career, but just this moment where you're like, like that makes sense. All of the things that I've experienced and gone through now kind of make sense. I'm starting to see the red thread here. Or maybe, oh, I understand why I had to go through that thing or why those things didn't work out in the past because it was actually preparing me for this thing. And again, this can happen on a huge level of, you know, my whole entire life is shifted and changed now because of this aha clicking moment. But usually, you know, it's smaller and more incremental things that start to become more obvious that then when we look back, we're like, oh, there were so many little clicks along the way. And they have now kind of reimagined for me where I'm going or where I want to be going and painted this picture of what this actually all means. So I love to reference like this movie montage, 2000s movie montage moment, or when you're in or you're watching like a spy movie and they start to go through the exact setup of the plan of what they're going to do and you see them actually do it. And you have like this sense of inner peace of like, oh, I know it's working out. Like they're walking me through it as they're doing it. So the plan is working. And so you kind of have this feeling of like this plan is unfolding the way that it should be. And so unlike these movie moments, that is not how this clicking feeling usually feels, right? It's like, ooh, that makes sense. I understand how everything is meant to tie together now. But it's not this easy, breezy, beautiful montage scene then or execution of this, you know, heist plan where everything runs smoothly. So this is all to just say like, this is what I've been going through the last couple months, even the last years. And it's now finally all kind of threading together. It's like we're weaving this beautiful tapestry. And maybe you resonate with this feeling as well of, again, things are clicking, things are starting to make sense. And the truth is, a lot of times things get shaken up so aggressively for you to actually understand that they need to click together in a different way. So it's almost like you're building this puzzle. Have all the pieces laid out in front of you, but you kind of have like random little clumps of these pieces that you're trying to fit together and you think that they're fitting. And then all of a sudden something comes and it's like an earthquake and it shakes the ground that you have built these foundations on and it throws them all up in the air. And as they're all up in the air, you suddenly see them in a different light, or you're like, okay, this is interesting. I really thought that these really all had to go together over here, all these pieces, but I now am seeing as they fall down on the ground completely spread out and like spewed all over the place that they actually relate to each other in a different way. And then you start to put those pieces together. And the clicking moment is when you turn your head to the side and you actually realize that the puzzle box is sitting right there and it is presenting you this big picture vision, right? And now you're like, oh, I see. I was trying to fit these pieces together because I thought that the picture that I was building was a mountain, but really it's a river. And now I see that these pieces actually don't go together at all. But because I have this big picture vision, I can start to make things click into place more and more now. So it's kind of just to say this metaphorical story that this is a process, right? There's this clicking moment that we have. There might be many little clicking moments along the way. You might look back in retrospect and realize that you've missed a lot of the clicking moments because you've been busy trying to enforce the plan that you wanted to have, you know, play out. And then you see the big picture and you're like, I see that. So that is where we are at right now. And I know you're on the edge of your seat because you're like, okay, girl, you've just like gone through minutes of metaphors. But I want you to just reflect again, because we're collectively moving through energy together at the same time. If this lands for you personally in your life, but this is what I have been going through. And the one biggest theme that has come out of it for me is that the work I have been doing for the last 5 years in my business, the work that has been my biggest work in my life, and what I have now seen as that image on my puzzle box is that everything we're doing here is about relationships, and specifically about the relationship patterns that in turn play out in your relationship dynamics. So I reflected a lot, and this is what I want to share with you here about, where my work has taken me over the last 5 years, and even before that, because this is work that was in the making way before I even started coaching or started making money in my business. And when I look back, it really does make so much sense that my personal experience, my own stories and narratives, and things that I've learned about relationships over the course of my life has really been a core theme for me. And it continued to show up over and over and over again in various different relationships. And one of the things that I love to reflect on is that, your mess or your wound is your biggest message or your wand. So your mess is your message, your wound is your wand. And out of the things that you've experienced, often you can create the most beautiful medicine. And I was very resistant to this for a very long time, which is why I think that, in all honesty, this is only coming to the surface now and actually becoming something that I'm fully leaning into. Because when I started my business, my first business, I was doing decluttering. For those of you who are newer here, that's where I began. And I would go into people's homes and I would help them declutter. And then I shifted it online because I realized, hey, actually, I really don't want to go into people's homes and see all of their stuff. I want to help them understand why they feel attached to their things, the relationship, keyword there, that is building there, that they feel they need to stay attached to in some way, or that they feel they need to show up for this thing in some way. And like we're having a hard time letting go of things. Why? What's actually happening underneath? Then I shifted into working on decluttering, quote unquote, decluttering, because it was a gradual shift. Calendars and schedules and time management, really focusing in on productivity. I was super focused with my clients on helping them create work-life balance and productivity-based structures that, again, linked to underlying conditionings. What is showing up for you? Why do you feel so attached to this thing? Why do you feel like you need to show up that way? And the common thread that began linking all of these things together was relationship dynamics, right? Why do we feel like we need to show up for something a certain way in the first place? Well, it's because of how we've been conditioned, how we've been raised, how we interact with the people around us, how we interact with the people at work or in our family situations. And it's really interesting when you don't have, like, you almost have a blinder on. And then you have this click moment, you see the picture on the puzzle box, and you're like, oh, like every single conversation I had with pretty much every single client tied back to relationships, tied back to what they were navigating in their relationships, tied back to the underlying patterns that were coming up for them in their intimate relationships. And I say intimate relationships, meaning, your personal relationships. It doesn't need to mean sensual or sexually intimate relationships, but it can be that. But your family members, your one-on-one relationships with friends, your one-on-one relationships with your partner, these very personal and interpersonal relationships where intimacy really comes down to feeling safe enough to be vulnerable, or your ability to be vulnerable in those dynamics, in those situations, to ask for what you need, get your needs met, communicate your deepest and often darkest truths. And that is, again, this red thread that continued to connect so much of the work that I was doing with clients. So, in short, this core thread has been carried out through each of the phases of the work that I've done as my business has shifted from the first business to the business that I'm now running now. And it all comes down to healing these underlying powers. Wow, patterns, but these are powerful patterns, and you can derive a lot of power from healing these patterns. That's where my brain was going with that. What is also really interesting, and this is what I want to invite invite you in with, and to call the version of you who is like this in, or, these kinds of women into this space, is I've always worked and I've always attracted really soft, empathetic, and often also highly sensitive, identifying women, where you care so fiercely and so deeply, but it also makes you feel so deeply, feel so much for the other person, feel worried about hurting that person, then feel worried about whether or not that person is going to be angry with you, making that harder to enforce a particular boundary. And again, that can apply back to my first business around decluttering, but also around time management and productivity. Like, these themes continued, and now it's getting so clear that it's actually about how you show up first and foremost in your relationships, your intimate ones, those direct ones that you interact with one-on-one on a pretty consistent basis. And then, of course, that relationship with yourself. And that relationship with yourself is where these patterns play out. It's the default mode within you, the software that's playing out. And that relationship with yourself is where you navigate and enforce the kind of patterns that you want to actually have, because patterns are naturally what are going to occur. And it's kind of like that train track that guides you. We need these patterns in place. It's how we run on a very important autopilot. Otherwise, you'd be expending so much energy to constantly be thinking about all these things. But we want to make sure that those patterns are serving you. And for 99.9999% of us, we don't learn how to actively enforce or install patterns that are actually serving us. We're just always on the initial default mode. And if we don't ever look at that, I'm going to guarantee you right now, there's part of that at least that is not serving you. And that is what we're doing here. So that brings us all back to today and what we're doing in this space now. So Essence, the podcast, is coming back. We're going to be talking about healing the heart of your relationship patterns, understanding relationship dynamics, understanding why you show up in a certain way in your relationships, understanding how that's impacting you, how that's impacting your relationships, how to shift out of that, and really doing it in a way that is paired with a element of spirituality, this energetic, the energetic laws that enforce our universe, enforce our world, that guide us, and really talking about how those impact you. How can you lean into that? How can you feel supported in that? Because there's something bigger at play here that's also impacting how you show up and how you can hold yourself through navigating difficulties in your relationships, or just challenging times even. And pairing this kind of spiritual element with really practical, pragmatic, step-by-step processes, because that is where I thrive. That is where we talk about all of the subconscious reprogramming and actual tools that will help you shift these things and put into place the programs and the patterns that you do want to be having. So, for example, this can be attachment styles, and we're not going to just be talking about attachment styles, but I think that this is a common topic that might make a lot of sense here. Understanding if you tend to be more avoidant, more fearful avoidant, more anxiously attached, how are those playing out in your relationships? Where do those come from? How do we shift out of those? And again, you don't need to be able to identify with one of those or know what those are. We all have patterns, but that's just a very common pattern that we see play out a lot. And often it helps us to be able to identify with something like that. So this is the space for understanding your subconscious patterns, the conditioning you've grown up with, and the cycles that play out in your relationships, the ones that you are aware of and the ones that potentially linger in the shadows. So I have a whole little list on my Substack post about what kind of patterns these can look like for you. So please go check that out if you would like a little bit more insight. I will link it below. But this is the space where we dive into that. So I'm so excited to bring out the first series for this new Revamped Essence podcast, where we're going to be going into the foundations of understanding your relationship patterns. So it's going to give you everything that you need to know to dive deeper and to provide you for the groundwork for building on this, right? So understanding, okay, this is what's going on. Now I can actually do something with that. So I'm going to invite you to listen to the teaser trailer as well, just to get the vibe, see if this is for you. I invite you to pass this on to someone who you think would love this podcast, love to dive into these topics more deeply. Click follow wherever you're following along, click subscribe. You can also subscribe to Substack, which is where this podcast is hosted, and get a newsletter in combination with every episode that comes out. And I just want to thank you so much for being here. If you've been with me since the beginning, I am so, so grateful that you've been here through all of the adjustments and pivots. And I'm so, so excited to dive into something that feels so obvious and so aligned, and to have you along on that journey with me. So sending you so much love, and I'll see you on the Essence podcast.